Guys, just soak in these graphics. Just sit back and wonder how great the Frostbite engine looks. Well, usually looks pretty good. Not today though, as for some reason I've decided to go out of my way to make it look as bad as possible. Welcome to what I've labelled the Potato Mode Challenge. Now, Frostbite is one of the best engines around for visuals. Over the years since its introduction, we've had amazing looking games like BF3, 4, Star Wars Battlefront, Need for Speed, and of course, Battlefield 1. The visual fidelity that Frostbite offers is just incredible, so it's no easy feat to make it look really, really bad. But you can achieve anything when you put your mind to it. So I've turned all of the settings down to as low as they can possibly go, and then on top of that I've reduced the resolution scale to its lowest amount. In this case that's 25%. I even went a step further and found as many config commands as I could to improve the frames per second at the expense of visual fidelity. So who knows how much of a difference those actually made, because honestly, once you've turned down the resolution scale, it already looks really bad. It's just Blur City. It's very hard to see details, players, but that's kind of the point. I was running at 1080p, so that's 1920 by 1080, but because of the resolution scale, you're actually running at only 25% of that, hence why it looks so bad. Now, for my weapon, I wanted to go with something automatic because I knew that I would have some issues seeing players at range, as you could imagine, and I really didn't want to have to use a scope, so I ended up using the Fedorov as a medic. As it turned out, I did a quick match and the map worked in my favour because Fort de Vaux I think is a pretty good map to do this challenge on, as most of the engagements are pretty close range. It wasn't intended, I just quick matched in and said to myself that I was going to play on whatever map that I got, so look at the draw, I got lucky with that one. Even still, when you head outside, that's when the blur really kicks in. Because when you're inside the corridors, it really doesn't show how low the resolution is. Once you head to the outside flags though, that's when it becomes way more apparent. This would have been even harder if we were on a large outdoors map, or I dread to think something like Argonne Forest with all of that vegetation. That would have been absolutely diabolical. Speaking of visuals though, one thing that has always really impressed me is the improvements to Frostbite through each iteration of the engine. And I'm talking specifically about visuals here. When BF3 launched, I remember thinking how impressive it looked. They showed us new animations, incredible visuals, incredible sound, everything that we now take for granted with the new Frostbite engine game. And then games like BF4 came with Levolution and stuff, and more specifically Star Wars Battlefront. The first Star Wars game that DICE made looked incredible when that launched, and one of the reasons for that was a method known as photogrammetry, where they use actual photos of certain Star Wars related items to provide the best visuals possible. They even used it on Endor with things like rocks and trees, and I think it was utilised in BF1 too, but I remember it being much more of a talking point around Battlefront. I also remember them talking about physically based rendering, which is a very impressive tech too. But before BF1 launched, I then thought to myself again, well, where do they go now to make these games look even better? But somehow they did. The textures look better on BF1, the levels were more detailed, animations are better, and then the same when Battlefront 2 released. Visually, Frostbite is always evolving, and with the next game, Battlefield 5, it looks like they're further improving it once again. The movement is of course a massive part of that, now with the ability to burst through windows and dive in all directions, but when you see the soldier at the end of the trailer, and you see the fidelity on his face, you realise how far not only the Frostbite engine has come, but also games in general. One thing that we always somewhat take for granted though is the audio design. It's absolutely phenomenal, and it often doesn't get the credit that it deserves. If you jump into a live game of Battlefield, it's sometimes hard to pick out all of the individual audio elements. You hear the gunshots, you hear the soldier VO, you hear the vehicle sounds, and they all blend together so well. But if you go on a server on your own, like I often have to do when taking thumbnails or searching for stuff or recording, you realise just how much detail goes into the audio, especially the ambience. On Fort de Vaux, for example, the pipes creak. You can hear the sound of fires around the map and running water dripping. You can hear planes fly overhead and gunshots and explosions and artillery in the distance. Sound is a huge part of the immersion, and sometimes you get so involved in just playing the game, you don't realise how much audio detail is around you. And the destruction too. That's a huge part of Battlefield games these days, and it can't be easy making so much destruction while keeping the game and server performance high. Frostbite somehow pulls it off though, and there really aren't any other games nowadays that are comparable. With BF4 we had Levolution, huge events that changed the way that we play maps drastically, and while it doesn't look like we're getting those big scripted destruction events in BF5, DICE have said that it's still improved in its own way. So if we look at the destruction in BF1, I think it's still impressive, but it's also quite linear and predictable. If you fire a tank shell or use explosives on a building, it will break, the wall will crumble, but it does so in a very predetermined way. And also very quickly. It's impressive for sure, but it's also an area that was open to improvement with the next game. And in BF5, DICE have said that destruction happens in a much less linear fashion. If a tank pushes into a house, it will cause the structure of the house to break and crumble in a realistic way, and in whatever direction that tank entered. We caught a glimpse of it in the trailer, and wood will splinter and debris will fall around the tank. And if that same tank was to shoot into the side of the house, the wall will collapse inwards as it explodes, or if an explosion goes off inside the house, then the explosion will push the walls outwards. It sounds like the new system will just make blowing stuff up way more dynamic, and in a way that goes back towards how it used to be in Bad Company 2. And I'm sure that anyone that played that game will remember that you could pretty much level the entire map, and that was great, but it also meant that sometimes you had zero cover. I think BF1 did a pretty good job of balancing the destruction, and BF5 looks to be improving on that with Fortifications. The biggest difference from BF1 of course is the fact that you can restore cover to a house that's been destroyed by adding, let's say, sandbags or ladders around it to give it a bit more of a defense, or build a machine gun nest, and that's something that would have been very useful back in Bad Company 2. In BF5 we've also been told how the environment around you will become a factor in gameplay, another big change for the engine and the game as a whole. Daniel Berlin, who is the design director at DICE, said that if you move through bushes or tall grass, the grass will actually move, and because of that an enemy might actually see that movement and learn your position and could then try to take you out. We've got bullet penetration too. Bullets can now go through certain surfaces, and also if you're in a wooden house for example, an enemy could just light up the house with sustained fire and potentially injure or kill you. I'm really interested though to see how this plays out in terms of hit markers. I personally don't think you should get a hit marker or any indication that you hit someone through a surface, but we'll see what DICE does with that. The whole environment is going to be a far bigger factor in gameplay and way more dynamic than it's ever been. As you can see, the engine and every Frostbite game that comes out improves upon so many things that might not be obvious straight away. DICE are constantly working on the engine, and it becomes such a tool now for EA that so many other games utilise, from FPS games like Battlefield to racing games like Need for Speed and even the latest Mass Effect. Every time a new game like this comes out, I always wonder how they're going to make it look better, and yet they always do. And imagine what games are going to look like in 10 years time. I reckon this also has another side effect though. As other games utilise the engine, they can almost certainly add features and do things that perhaps the engine wasn't initially designed to do. And that's just an assumption on my part because I don't know for sure. But if you take an engine that was built for Battlefield and then make it work with a racing game, there definitely has to be certain things changed up and added, right? And I think that can only be a good thing in the long run. Back to the game though, as we come to the end of this potato warfare. I know that I've taken this to an extreme here to prove a point, but the resolution scale can be a good tool to use if you're having FPS issues, or perhaps your PC isn't quite up to scratch, and you can utilise the resolution scale to help ease your problems. I'm not saying that you should drop it down to 25%, but knocking off 5 to 10% could give you a small improvement in some cases without suffering too much visual fidelity. The same applies if you want to crank the visuals up too. You may have a really powerful PC but perhaps only a 1080p monitor. Well, what you could do is increase your resolution scale, which will then downsample it back to 1080p, and you'll get a much sharper image overall at the expense of some performance. Not everyone loves playing at 144 FPS, in fact I think some players are happy playing at 60. That being said, not all players care for immense graphics in their multiplayer games either. I like a nice blend. So overall I think this game went pretty well. I ended up 32 for 5, which I thought was pretty decent all things considered. The map itself though did help the situation because it was so close range, but honestly when the game was over I couldn't wait to put it back to normal resolution. All of a sudden I could see things again. The flip side of using this though, the benefits are that the performance is fantastic, and I don't know if it's just a placebo effect, but when playing like this the hit reg just feels absolutely phenomenal. I don't know if there's some technical reason for that or it's all in my head, but the hit reg was just fantastic. I don't know, maybe it was just a good server. It did actually make my head hurt a little bit though. I think it's because I really had to focus and leaning forwards to see enemies or silhouettes, as that's pretty much all they were. And that's all for today folks. If you enjoyed the video, give me a like. If you didn't, a dislike, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.